afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us for the latest installment of our virtual programming series. My name is Greg Mencken. I am the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society. I want to welcome all of you here today and wish you, of course, health and safety during these very challenging times. We, of course, hope that we can all get together again soon. And until we can do that, we are going to continue to bring you conversations, discussions, interviews with some of the leading experts in the country on a wide variety of subjects. If you're not already a member of the Adam Smith Society and would like to learn more, please visit us at adamsmithsociety.com. We're very pleased to be joined today by one of the nation's leading restructuring experts, Steve Fleming, for a conversation about his insights on the front lines of the economic impact of the coronavirus. Steve is a partner and U.S. head of restructuring at PwC, where he spent 22 years providing business advisory services for clients across all industries. And I got to just point out that 22 years, Steve, I think you've spent your entire career at PwC, is that correct? Since college, since business school?
Yeah, since my first job making bagels on Long Island, I've been with PwC ever since.
Well, you can go from making bagels to running one of the most important practice groups at PwC. So truly, anything is possible if you work hard. Steve has worked out of London and Dubai, and now he's based in New York. Like many of us on the line today, Steve does have his MBA. He's a graduate of Columbia Business School, and he was once recognized by M&A Advisor as a recipient of their 40 Under 40 award. I want to just point out that was once recognized. I don't know if that would remain current today, but something worth noting. Steve and I are going to have a conversation today for about 20 minutes or so. After that, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Please note this conference is being video recorded. If you'd like to submit your question, please use your controls in your GoToWebinar controls. My colleague Dean Ball will ask questions once we get to that period. Please state your name and chapter affiliation to ask a question. And so let's get started here. So Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I'd like to just kick things off by asking you generally, what are you seeing on the front lines of the economic fallout from coronavirus?
Well, first off, Greg, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be with you all today. While front lines, that perhaps makes me seem more important than I am relative to all the others that are truly on the front lines, our medical professionals and first responders. So first off, I want to express my gratitude to all of those who are truly on the front lines, helping make this a safer place for all of us. As it relates to the economy, I'm going to try to not use the word extraordinary. It's an overly used word. It's a really, really interesting dynamic right now. So I was just preparing for this conversation, and something that shocked me is that if you look at the NASDAQ index, for example, today it's trading higher than it was on January 1st of this year. And I point that out because there's seemingly a very large disconnect between the equity markets and how they're pricing in the economic fallout relative to what me and a lot of my colleagues, not just at PwC, but I would say more broadly in the restructuring industry, are seeing. And let me make that a little bit more real and give some tangible evidence of that. This morning, some of you may have read, Thursday is when the unemployment statistics come out, and the market seemingly rallied when we only added an additional 3 million to the list of those who are first-time unemployment filers. And to put that in perspective, if we go back 10 years ago to the Great Recession, the country peaked at 10 million in absolute terms that had filed for active job seekers who had filed for unemployment. This morning's release has the nation at 30 million. And what's shocking about that, forget about the fact that it's 3 times the amount that the last economic crisis that we all witnessed. But if you look at it both on a percentage terms and absolute basis, it's actually just surpassed the peak in 1933 in the Great Depression. So that's just one example of this seemingly massive disconnect between those out there that are still talking about the prospect of a V-shape or even U-shaped recovery. And I'll tell you, when I'm seeing on the front lines, I hate to be, Dr. Doom here or the bearer of bad news. I personally subscribe more to the Nike swoosh theory around an economic recovery.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you break that down a little bit for us by industry? Are there a couple of industries that you find particularly challenging or interesting, whether that be retail, hospitality, travel, energy? Is there something that you're really kind of focused on or looking at?
Well, you just stole my thunder, so thanks. Look, it's everything that you just said. I mean, I think the most obvious ones out there are anything retail and consumer, and there's never been a time, and I don't want to say the history of mankind, but you go back hundreds of years where on a global basis, the economy just came to a screeching halt, and malls closed, non-essential retail closed. Extend that to travel, transportation, airlines on a global basis, parked, hotels unoccupied, manufacturing facilities shuttered. I mean, the U.S. and global automotive industry has never, ever, even through world wars, never ceased production through their facilities, either at the OEM level or their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. Yet today, all of the big global manufacturers, not just of cars, airplanes, washing machines, you name it, the supply chains have come to a grinding halt. So as I think about some of the losers in this fallout from an economic standpoint, retail, particularly specialty apparel, particularly restaurants, hospitality, leisure, transportation, energy. I think we were all glued to our screens a few weeks ago when, for the first time ever, oil went to negative. I think it peaked at roughly negative $37 a barrel, and what that implies is that the upstream E&P companies, the producers, had to actually pay somebody $37 a barrel because they can't just turn off their wells on a dime. So if I can go on, I would say those are probably the 4 or 5 industry sectors that are not only the hardest hit today, but as I kind of liken this to the second inning of a 9-inning baseball game, I think those industries are going to continue. Unfortunately, when the economy rebounds, they're going to continue to struggle as the new norm is established and as behaviors that we all took for granted 60 days ago, at least in the immediate short term, I'm talking 3, 6, 9, 12 months, are probably significantly modified.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned some losers. Have you seen any surprise, winners, so to speak? One might expect a Zoom or a Netflix to do well in an environment where no one can go anywhere and everyone's going online. Did you see anyone doing well under this environment that surprised you?
Well, that's a key distinction there that surprised me. It doesn't surprise me that businesses that were geared towards at-home digital, they're obviously much better positioned to weather this current environment. In terms of surprise, I see some interesting dynamics play out. Let me share one that I think the audience may hopefully find as interesting as I think it is. I've got 2 little kids at home, and in the early stages of the quarantine, we were very pleased to see that Trolls, which was due to be released, I think the last week, Trolls 2, the last week of March, that Universal Studios made the decision to bypass the theaters and release it for rental for $19.99. And it's Friday night. The kids were looking for something to do. We rented it. The movie was okay, but that's besides the point. 30 days later, when Universal reported their earnings, what was surprising to them and what was surprising to me, and it's going to have continued fallout here, and this is just an example of a winner and loser. The winner here was Universal, because in the 3 weeks that they released the movie direct to home, again, only on a rental basis, you couldn't buy it, they netted more money in those 3 weeks than they did the entire theatrical release of Trolls 1, which was a box office smash hit. And as a result, they came out and said the next day that on a go-forward basis, they are going to concurrently release their new movies, both direct to consumer and through the theaters. So, win for Universal. Now let's talk about the losers. Well, AMC, the largest movie theater operator in the country, the very next day came out and said, they are going to ban Universal Pictures from all of their theaters, and they're by far the largest domestic and global operator of theaters. So, winners and losers, that certainly was unexpected, and I think the economics may spur similar strategies at the other 5 big movie studios as an example. And I'm fascinated just watching this war play out between the two, and the movie studios could come out and be the big winners here, and movie theaters may one day just sort of be like a niche, just like we may think of a drive-in movie theater today as a novelty. In 10 or 20 years time, maybe actually going and watching a movie in the theater may be as novel as it is today to watch it at a drive-in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, one day we'll have to talk about movie, and we'll have you back on as a movie critic. And so we'll book that at some point in the future. The big conversation now globally is getting back to work. So there's the health crisis. We're trying to emerge from that, and now companies are trying to figure out how to get back to work. So talk to us a little bit about what that might look like, especially as it relates to commercial real estate. What do you see happening in the real estate market as a result?
Sure. One thing I'd place a fairly large wager on is that, again, when I say short term, I'm thinking 6, 9, 12 months, less than a year. In that short term, things are going to be drastically different. And what I'm seeing and hearing on the front lines are that large employers is a very common theme, which is, one, they're not going to rush their employees back to the office. 2, as they do think about bringing their employees back to the office, the way they work is going to be drastically different. And there's a bunch of articles in the Wall Street Journal in recent days talking about the density or occupancy ratios in buildings, which, if you think about it as a ratio of 100%, I hear some companies saying, well, in the next 3 to 6 months when we open up, we may manage towards a 15, 20, 25% occupancy ratio and just try to not have the density in the office. If you think about the implications of that, they're profound. I use my office in Midtown Manhattan as an example. Let's say, for argument's sake, we get back in July and we're 15 or 20% occupancy, which means most of us are still working from home. Think about all the restaurants that relied on a lunch crowd or a dinner crowd or client entertaining meetings. Just think about the value of real estate as businesses rethink. Usually one of the 2 largest expenses of most businesses are their employees and then real estate. And I think what we've all just sort of proven by, not by choice, is that life can go on, business can operate, and in some instances more efficiently. I mean, deals are getting done in record speed because everybody's accessible on demand, whether it's, Zoom or Google Meet or whatever other technology. And you're starting, working earlier, you're working later, but you know what? That commuting time that was a waste of 2 or 3 hours has now been turned into productive time. So I hear CEO after CEO coming out saying, the way we're going to think about real estate in the future is going to be very different. And again, if I think about when my kids are in the workforce, the idea of commuting on a train or a bus to the city every day, that may kind of go the way of the dinosaur as well.
hmm And so, as companies try to recover, try to come back, whether it's in the office or not in the office, obviously there are a lot of unknowns out there. What is the progression of the coronavirus going to look like? What new government policies are going to come down the line? How are you advising companies to think about these unknowns, whether it's the progression of the disease itself or the government response to it?
Well, that's a great question. It seems like every conversation I have with a client is exactly along those lines. And the advice I give is almost always the same, which is, and look, this isn't rocket science. To me, it's just sort of good, prudent management of either a business or even your own personal finances for that matter, which is plan for the worst and hope for the best. So, as I'm talking to clients, and whether they're in the retail industry or it almost doesn't matter, everybody is faced with the same set of challenges. When am I going to be able to reopen, and what is that going to look like? If you're a retailer, if you're a restaurant, and let's say you can open up in June or July, what are my sales going to be? What's my foot traffic going to be? And what I advise clients to do is to not be overly optimistic and have a hockey stick projection, that to run a realistic worst case scenario and then go from there and figure out, what does that mean? What does that look like? Do I have enough liquidity to operate a week, a month, a quarter, a year, 2 years? Am I at risk of tripping a covenant in one of my credit agreements, which may give my lenders rights that would potentially cause me to lose control? Those are probably the number one and number two considerations that should be on the top of any business's mind. And I'll use an extreme as an example. If you run that analysis and it says you've got 30 days or 60 days before you either run out of cash or trip a covenant, the recommended action items are going to be very different than if you run that analysis and you say, I've got a year to 18 months and I've got plenty of headroom in my covenants. And in that scenario, the actions you're going to take are going to be less severe than if you're in a crisis mode where you're fighting for the survival of your business.
Mm-hmm. And so in their survival, how are companies reacting to the federal government response to this, whether it's the CARES Act or the Federal Reserve? How have their actions impacted businesses and how businesses are making those decisions?
Well, first off, I think the programs have, I'm going to make a broad brush statement here, they by and large been a success. Having said that, with the size and the trillions of dollars and the speed at which this legislation not only needed to be drafted, but take the SBA, the Small Business Association, for example. I mean, they dispersed more in 2 weeks in funds than they might have in the last 3 years altogether. So it's to be expected that there were some kinks in the armor in terms of the execution. The response has varied, though, and you've probably seen headlines about some public companies have been shamed publicly for taking advantage of, for example, the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, and a few of them, I think Shake Shack might have been the first one to come out and offer to give the money back. And I think ever since that happened, I've been party to a number of conversations where companies are thinking, should I keep the loan? Should I not? Am I going to be subject to an audit? Am I going to be subject to some level of scrutiny or negative press or perception amongst my client base? I mean, Boeing's another example where one of their board members stepped down because she didn't believe that Boeing should take any public money, and in fact, Boeing ended up saying, no, we're not going to tap into these government programs, and they just went out a week ago, and I think, don't quote me on the number, but I think it was something staggering, like 25 billion or something like that they went out and raised in the capital markets as an alternative to the government bailouts. I think I've seen a combination of companies that have relied upon it and is perhaps given them that bridge that they needed to buy 60, 90 days and try to preserve jobs. Some of the fitter companies that were stronger positioned or have a better business model have been able to tap the capital markets, which still are operating very, very efficiently. AMC, who I mentioned earlier, they raised $500 million 2 weeks ago. So the free market is working. Capital is being deployed, and it will. I think as this book gets written over the next 18 to 24 months, it's probably going to be the age-old tale of survival of the fittest.
At this point, I'd like to open it up to audience Q&A. As a reminder, please include your name and chapter affiliation in order to ask a question. I'd like to just kick things off, just keep things rolling a little bit here. Wanted to address the other side of this equation. We're talking about private sector and how companies are responding. I wanted to ask you, Steve, about the public sector. We're seeing obviously a lot of financial stress for states and municipalities. Just a couple numbers here. Michigan is looking at a $7 billion shortfall. Pennsylvania, $5 billion. In New York City alone, they're talking about almost a $7.5 billion loss of revenue this year, next year. What are you seeing for state governments and municipalities down the road? And what insights would you offer a mayor or a governor to get through this?
Well, that's a tough question. Look, those statistics are staggering, and this is sort of playing out real time. And unfortunately, there's politics at play as well in terms of the current administration in the White House. We're in an election year, and what this administration's willingness might be at the federal level to bail out states and cities and local municipalities, as opposed to how the election plays out in November. I mean, they could have drastic implications on how this movie ultimately ends. About 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it's longer, I lose track of the years, there was a lot of talk about a wave of municipal bankruptcies, and everybody was gearing up for a ton of Chapter 9s, which is how a municipality would need to file for bankruptcy. And you know what? It never happened. I mean, there were a few, the city of Detroit, I think Detroit, Jefferson County, but that wave of municipal bankruptcies actually never played out. I think it's too early to tell whether that will be the case here. But there's only so many ways to plug a hole, right? It's either raise taxes, or as the economy recovers and some of that tax revenue regenerates, cut expenses. De Blasio was out in the news the other day talking about having to curtail services in the city of New York, or for the federal government to come in and provide some relief using the balance sheet of the country as opposed to a state or a municipality. And if all those things fail, then bankruptcy or restructuring would be a last resort.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I think we have some questions now from some of our members.
The first question is from Jordan Mooney from our Boston University chapter. He asks, of the companies you're working with, are their problems primarily pandemic related, or has it accelerated the pace of decline in businesses already in trouble? In other words, how many sound businesses are we losing?
That's a very good question. It's a little early to tell. So this morning's headline was Neiman Marcus filed for bankruptcy. And I'll use that as an example that given what I do for a living as the head of a restructuring practice, Neiman Marcus has been on my targeting list for 3 years. So I use that as an example of a business that was over-levered. Arguably, department stores are not as relevant today as they were 10 or 20 years ago. Lots of competition, and I think that probably falls into the bucket of COVID-19 was an accelerator to probably what was inevitable. I can't think of an example of a really healthy business that has gone into bankruptcy, but they're out there. And I am working with clients right now who are deeply distressed as a result of COVID-19. And 6-8 weeks ago, they were healthy businesses. They weren't over levered. And depending on where they are in the country and what subsector or what industry they're in, some of these companies have had their revenue turned off overnight. So even the best run companies never prepared for a black swan event where all of a sudden for a period of 2 to 3 months your revenue goes from X million or X tens of millions a month to zero. And there's only so many levers you can pull. You can lay off or furlough your staff. You can stop paying rent, which seemingly most retailers have decided to do, which is causing dislocation in the real estate markets. And then you can try to raise capital. And then if all those things fail, then you may quote unquote lose some of those businesses. But that's back to my baseball analogy. I think for those businesses, we're still perhaps in the top of the second inning, and there's still a lot of baseball to be played to see how the game ultimately ends.
A member of our New York City professional chapter asks, what role does the free enterprise have in helping to accelerate an economic recovery?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the economic recovery is only going to come as a result of the free enterprise. There's again, let's bring this back to its basic building blocks. It's survival of the fittest. Our capital markets in this country are the most efficient and dynamic in the world. And I'm not trying to sound like President Trump. I say everything is beautiful, everything is great. I mean, our capital markets are truly the envy of the world, and they will figure out how to deploy capital quickly. And in my experience, what I'm seeing and what I've seen over my career is that the smart money, I'll use what Warren Buffett did back in 2008 and actually it was closer to 2011 when Bank of America was on the brink, and Warren Buffett stepped up and it put in, I think, was it $2 or $3 billion in the form of preferred equity with warrants attached to it. And of course, Bank of America, rebounded and ended up thriving. And that $2 billion ended up turning into something like $6 or $7 billion for Warren Buffett. So that's your example of free enterprise and capitalism. Smart money will figure out what are the good underlying businesses that are just dealing with this black swan event. Where do I deploy my capital in the capital structure, debt, preferred stock, equity? And then over time, when the economy rebounds, they'll be, not only will those businesses be saved and they'll be healthy and stronger than before, but those capital providers that took the risk and deploy their capital will be rewarded, very handsomely.
Mm-hmm. I think we have another member question.
Yes. Alex Cohn from our USC Marshall chapter asks, what is the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on capital allocation plans, M&A specifically?
Well, again, I'll try to make as broader general of a comment as I can. I think by and large, in the immediate short term, M&A has been put on hold. And I'll share a very public announcement 2 days ago. Sycamore Capital, which is a big private equity fund that focuses on retail, amongst other things, had announced the deal to acquire Victoria's Secret from L Brands. And as a result of the current environment, they pulled out of the deal. Litigation commenced, and 2 days ago, a joint press release was issued where both the seller and the buyer agreed to part ways. So I think we've seen some deals that were in progress either put on hold or called off. And from what I've seen, M&A by and large is somewhat suspended, just given the uncertainty out there. It's really hard to value these businesses, and I think some of the smart money is sitting on the sidelines right now, just waiting to see how things play out. I do believe that in a matter of weeks or months, once the economy more broadly starts to reopen and hopefully once COVID-19 is more under control, or perhaps we're closer to a treatment or a vaccine, I do think we will see an explosion in M&A activity. But in the immediate short term, it's just sort of somewhat suspended given the, again, I promised I wouldn't use the word extraordinary, but given the extraordinary nature of these events.
And we have another member question.
Arun Lamada from our SMU chapter asks, will this pandemic and associated market weakness be an opportunity or threat for private equity firms, particularly with regards to distressed assets and record amounts of uninvested dry powder?
I think it's going to be an opportunity of epic proportions. I mean, I see some of the bigger funds out there right now, out doing fundraising and to add more dry powder. And as this plays out, if you believe my analogy that we're in the second inning of a 9-inning game, and maybe this game even goes into extra innings, I think there's going to be ample opportunity for the private equity industry to deploy capital at valuations they could have only dreamed about 3 months ago. And if you look at some of the greatest trades of all time, they've been distressed companies. I think if you Google this transaction, I think this may go down in history as one of the best private equity trades of all time, which is when Apollo acquired Hostess Brands at a bankruptcy. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I promise you, if you Google it, you'll probably pull up a decent amount of information. And the return on invested capital is like the stuff that legends are made of. So I use that as an example of, to answer your question, I think there's going to be tremendous opportunity, and the private equity funds that have that subject matter expertise with respect to distressed assets will thrive.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to ask a couple questions. Many of our members of the Adam Smith Society end up in consulting. And so I think it would be really informative for our members to hear a little bit about that, and really just tell us a little bit about how has the consulting industry responded to the crisis.
I'll do my best to. I mean, the consulting industry is very broad. So when I think about consulting, like you've got strategy consulting shops, you've got the Accentures of the world, technology consulting. You've got the boutiques that focus on turnaround and restructuring, like Alex Partners and Alvarez and Marcel, and clearly they're doing very well as a result of the current environment. Then you've got the big four like PwC, which are much more diversified and have very large portions of their business that are compliance or statutory driven, like audit and tax. And I think if you looked at how the industry is responding, the answer would be different depending on which subsector of consulting that you dove into. And I would venture a guess that my competitors in consulting are probably trying to hire as many people as they can right now. And I would venture a guess that in other segments of consulting, perhaps there could be hiring freezes, or there could be some revisiting of growth plans in the immediate short term. So I think it varies, and in some instances, I mean, look, consulting firms are very good at pivoting and being opportunistic, and I would say as a broad brush comment, I see other consulting firms out in the market trying to hold themselves out as restructuring advisors right now, since it's more of the flavor of the day, certainly, than it was 60 days ago. So it'll be interesting to see how successful they are in the marketplace.
And would you have any advice for someone starting off new at a consulting firm coming out of business school?
Well, we might need another hour for that, but I'll try to boil it down to a few points. I'll use my own career as an example. When I started with Coopers & Lybrand back in the day, I never imagined I would have done 3/4 of the things that I've had the pleasure and opportunity to do over my career. So I think the best advice I can give anybody is to come into your career as a consultant with an open mind. Prepare to reinvent yourself continually over the course of your career. Just because you have that newly minted, MBA doesn't mean you're done learning. I use Warren Buffett as an example, and Bill Gates. I think they try to read something staggering like 10 books a week or something silly like that. There's no way. I listen to books, or at least I used to listen to books on my commute into work. You never stop learning, and you just need to be flexible. I mean, Greg, back to your question about what are consulting firms doing right now? Some of them are trying to reinvent themselves as restructuring advisors because they've got a good, core fundamental set of skill sets. They can do financial analysis, they know strategy, and they're going to try to figure it out. So I think as you approach your career, having an open mind, learning as much as you can, having as diverse of an experience as you can, as you progress in your career, I'm confident that those attributes will pave a way for success.
All right, thank you. And we have one last question from a member.
Yes, Alex Cohn from our USC chapter again has a follow-up question. Following on your analogy about being in the second inning of a 9-inning game, what characteristics do you think the next innings will have?
I like that question. I may use that in some of my client pitches. I think that right now there are a lot of businesses that are maybe in the shock and awe and denial phase, or approaching maybe the second inning is more of the Hail Mary that, there's 10 seconds left on the clock. I'm down by 6 and I'm on the 50-yard line. I got one play to win the game here. And occasionally you'll connect and you'll win the game, but sometimes you won't. And what I mean by that is that as the economy starts to restart, and if you think back about the question earlier around, best practices of, analyzing your cash and liquidity runway, assessing your covenant headroom analysis, if you're up against the clock there and you're going to run out of cash, or you're going to trip a covenant, and you haven't taken action, the third and fourth innings are when that crisis starts to play out more, and where you either have to take those draconian actions, whether it be, laying off a significant amount of your employees, or potentially even, filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So to me, those are sort of the middle innings for the industries that are on the front lines. And, to keep the analogy going to the later innings, it's the other industries that are connected, or affected rather, by some of those businesses that failed in the middle of the game, that will have a trickle down effect. So I'm going to make up an example just to illustrate the point. Let's say a large OEM, a car manufacturer, like in GM in 2009 when they filed for bankruptcy, they shut down Pontiac and they and other Saturn and other brands. So that would have been my third inning. All the suppliers that made the brakes and the transmission and all the other components that went into those cars, and then those suppliers had suppliers that made components for them. In the 6th, 7th, 8th inning, they started to fail as a result of their customer base diminishing. So I that's how I see things playing out. I think the third inning is when you're going to start seeing more headlines like the Neiman Marcuses of the world file for bankruptcy. The later innings is when businesses that perhaps were on a very solid footing 60 days ago ultimately succumb to these economic forces that even a good management team can't overcome.
Well, thank you, Steve, so much for that. The next time we have you on, Steve, we're going to talk about movies and baseball, and that's it. We'll totally mix things up.
We talk about Star Wars. You can see my collection behind me here, too.
We can talk Star Wars. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us today. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us. I invite everyone to tune in again next week. Thursday, May 14th, again, 1 p.m. Eastern. We will hear from economist and author Tyler Cowen about the crucial role that business plays in spurring innovation and creating a better society. So please tune in next week. That'll be a great discussion. Check out our full programming coming up on our website you see on your screen, and have a great day, everyone. Continued health and well-being to everyone. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.